What a journey. Mike's story proves that hard work and integrity always win in the end. But what do you think? Have you ever seen someone rise above betrayal like this? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far our stories travel. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss tomorrow's special story. It's one you won't want to miss. See you then. From nothing to everything, how he rebuilt his life after being fired. Mike Lawson had spent the last 30 years working at Carter's Auto Repair, pouring his heart and soul into the shop. At 58, his hands were rough, his knuckles scarred from decades of hard work, but he wouldn't have had it any other way. He had built this place from the ground up alongside the original owner, Harold Carter. They had started small, just a two-bay garage on the edge of town, but over the years it became one of the most trusted auto shops in Texas. Customers didn't just come for repairs. They came because they knew Mike would treat them fairly, never overcharging, never cutting corners. But none of that mattered today. Mike stood in front of Jason Trent's desk, his jaw tight. Jason, the new owner, leaned back in his expensive leather chair, tapping a pen against the desk like this was just another routine conversation. He was 38, sharp-dressed, and cared more about profit margins than people. His eyes held no regret, no hesitation. "I'm sorry, Mike. Business is business," Jason said, his tone casual, almost bored. Mike clenched his fists at his sides. 30 years, Jason. I trained half the guys in that shop. I kept this place running when Harold got sick, and you're just letting me go?" Jason sighed, rubbing his temple like Mike was exhausting him. "Look, you're great at what you do, no doubt, but times are changing. We need younger mechanics who can work faster, take lower wages. I've got investors to answer to. It's not personal." Not personal. The words hit Mike like a punch to the gut. After everything, he was just another number on a balance sheet. He felt a tightness in his chest, but he refused to let Jason see it. He wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "So what now?" Mike asked, his voice steady. "You expect me to pack up my tools and walk out like I was never here?" Jason shrugged. "Pretty much. There's a severance package, 3 months' pay. Consider it a thank you for your service." Mike exhaled slowly. His hands curled into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. Jason wasn't worth his dignity. He turned toward the door, but before stepping out, he stopped. Looking over his shoulder, he spoke in a low, firm voice. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." Jason chuckled, shaking his head. "We'll see about that." Mike didn't look back. By the time he reached his workstation, his toolbox was already packed. His nameplate, the one that had hung above his space for decades, was gone, erased. The younger mechanics barely made eye contact as he passed. Some looked guilty. Others just looked relieved it wasn't them. Outside, the cold wind stung his face as he stepped into the parking lot. His old Ford F-150 sat in the same spot it always had, but for the first time it felt different. He wasn't coming back. Mike threw his toolbox into the truck bed, climbed into the driver's seat, and gripped the steering wheel. 30 years of his life, gone in minutes. He turned the key, the engine rumbling beneath him. He had no idea what came next. Mike drove aimlessly for hours, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The familiar streets of town blurred past him, but he wasn't really seeing them. 30 years in one place, and now, nothing. No job, no purpose, no plan. The thought burned in his chest like a fire he couldn't put out. He had given everything to Carter's Auto Repair, and in the end, he was tossed aside like yesterday's trash. Eventually, he found himself parked in front of his small house, the same one he lived in for 20 years. He stepped out of his truck, toolbox in hand, and walked up the porch steps. The old wooden boards creaked beneath his weight, the porch light flickering as he unlocked the door. Inside, the silence hit him hard. No sound of an engine running, no smell of oil and grease, just the heavy stillness of an empty house. He set his toolbox down on the kitchen table and sank into a chair, rubbing his hands over his face. He never planned for this. He always thought he'd retire from Carter's, maybe train the next generation of mechanics, pass down the knowledge he'd spent decades perfecting. But Jason Trent had taken that away from him in seconds. His eyes landed on an old photo hanging on the wall, him and Harold Carter, standing in front of the shop when they first opened. Harold had been more than a boss. He was a mentor, a friend, someone who believed in loyalty and hard work. If he were alive today, he'd be ashamed of what had happened. Mike exhaled sharply and looked away. He needed to figure out what was next. The next morning, he woke up early out of habit. His body was still wired for routine, getting dressed, heading to the shop, working until his hands ached. But today, there was nowhere to go. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, staring at his calloused hands. He had never done anything else. Then an idea sparked in his mind. He grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts. There had to be someone, some shop, some old friend who needed a mechanic. One by one, he called the numbers. One by one, he got the same answer. We're not hiring. Budgets are tight. We'll keep you in mind. With each rejection, his frustration grew. He wasn't some rookie fresh out of school. He was Mike Lawson. He had built Carter's into what it was. And now, nobody had a place for him. By the afternoon, he was driving around town, stopping at every garage he could find. Some shops had kids barely out of high school working the bays. Others had owners who took one look at his age and saw a liability, not an asset. Hours passed, hope drained from him. Then, as he was about to call it a day, something caught his eye. A rundown garage on the outskirts of town. The sign above the door was faded, barely readable, but Mike recognized the name. It had once belonged to an old mechanic he used to know, a guy who had been around as long as him. Curiosity tugged at him. He pulled into the lot, shut off the engine, and stepped out. The building looked abandoned. The windows were dusty, the parking lot empty. But when he pushed on the door, it creaked open. Inside, the place was a mess, tools covered in dust, shelves half empty, an old hydraulic lift rusting in the corner. It smelled like forgotten potential, like something that had once been great but had been left to rot. Mike ran a hand over a rusted toolbox, his fingers tracing the outline of something that had been left behind. Then it hit him. For 30 years, he had built someone else's business, someone else's dream. Maybe it was time to build his own. Mike stood in the middle of the dusty garage, his boots planted firmly on the cracked concrete floor. The air smelled like old oil, forgotten memories, and a future that hadn't been written yet. He ran a hand over the rusted toolbox, feeling the weight of it, like it had a history that could still be revived. The place was a mess, sure, but it was his mess now. For years, he had been building someone else's business, following someone else's rules. But this was his chance to start over. Mike glanced around the garage again, imagining what it could be. The dust swirling in the sunlight, the tools cleaned and organized, the lift working again, and the customers returning, trusting him like they had in the old days. He could see it. His own shop. People would come here because they knew he wouldn't cheat them. He wouldn't overcharge them. He would fix their cars with integrity, just like he always had. But then the reality hit him. The place was falling apart. The equipment was outdated, the lift was rusted, and who knew if the wiring even worked? It would take more money than he had just to get the shop running again, and that was before thinking about how to bring in customers. After all, Greg's shop had a chokehold on the entire town. Most of Mike's old customers still went there, and Greg wasn't the type to let anyone leave easily. Mike let out a slow breath, the weight of it settling in his chest. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe he was just chasing a dream that was never going to happen. He turned to leave, but as he reached for the door, he froze. Tires crunching on gravel caught his attention. Mike stepped outside, his stomach tightening. He squinted, trying to make out who it was. The truck rolled to a stop, and an old man climbed out. His clothes were worn, his face weathered by years of hard work, but Mike recognized him instantly. It was Tom Reed, one of the best mechanics Mike had ever known. Tom had owned a shop years ago, and people came from miles around just to have him work on their cars. Word around town is you got kicked to the curb, Tom said, leaning against his truck with a knowing smirk. Mike crossed his arms. News travels fast, Tom chuckled. Always does in a town like this. His gaze shifted toward the garage. So what's the plan? Mike hesitated, then shook his head. I don't know if I have one. Tom laughed, a deep, genuine sound. That's not the Mike Lawson I know. You're the best damn mechanic in this town. Always have been. Mike's heart skipped a beat, but doubt still lingered. Even if I fix this place up, who's gonna come? Greg's shop has all the business. Tom's eyes sparkled with determination. That's where you're wrong. People are tired of Greg's nonsense. They just need an excuse to leave. Mike raised an eyebrow. An excuse? Tom grinned, patting the toolbox in the back of his truck. Loyal customers. They've been waiting for someone like you to show them there's a better way. The words hung in the air between them, and Mike felt something stir inside him. Maybe this wasn't a mistake after all. Maybe it was time to take a chance on himself. All right, Mike said, finally meeting Tom's gaze. Let's do it. And just like that, the spark was lit. Mike and Tom threw themselves into the work, their hands moving nonstop as they cleaned out the garage. Dust, grease, and old car parts filled the air as they scrubbed every surface, cleaned every tool, and repaired whatever they could. It was a mess, but slowly it was starting to look like something. The rusted lift was fixed, the lights rewired, and the oil stains on the floor were gone. They didn't have much, just sweat, determination, and a shared belief that this was their chance. As the days passed, word started to spread. At first, it was just a few curious customers who had heard about Mike's return. They stopped by to check out the shop, remembering the days when Mike had worked for Harold, when they could trust the mechanic with their cars. One by one, they returned, their faces filled with a mix of surprise and relief. Mike hadn't changed. He was still the same mechanic who wouldn't lie to them, who wouldn't push unnecessary repairs. They trusted him, and that trust began to rebuild his business. Then, one afternoon, a woman pulled up in a Honda Odyssey, her face tense with worry. She climbed out and walked toward the garage, glancing at Mike. I heard you were open, she said. My car's been making a noise, but Greg's shop told me it would take 2 weeks just to look at it. Can you help? Mike nodded, gesturing for her to pop the hood. Within minutes, he diagnosed the issue, a loose belt. It was a 10-minute fix. When he finished, he handed her the keys. You're good to go, he said. No charge for something that small. The woman's eyes widened. Greg told me I needed a full repair. He was going to charge me hundreds. Mike shrugged, wiping his hands on a rag. I just fixed what needed fixing. She smiled, grateful, and then without thinking said, I'm telling everyone about this place. Mike watched as she drove off, feeling a spark of hope. She wasn't the only one. More customers started showing up, sharing their stories about how Greg had overcharged them, lied about repairs, and treated them like they were nothing more than cash machines. They came to Mike, drawn by his honesty and integrity. But Greg wasn't happy about this. As Frank locked up one evening, he saw a familiar black luxury car pull into the lot. Jason Trent stepped out, his eyes cold, unreadable. He walked toward the garage, stopping a few feet from Mike. So this is what you've been up to, Jason said, his voice tinged with disdain. Mike crossed his arms, standing tall. You seem surprised. Jason smirked, but there was no humor in it. You made a mistake, old man. Mike met his stare, calm but firm. No, you did. You destroyed what you built. I just gave people another option. Jason's jaw tightened, and without saying another word, he turned and walked back to his car. The engine roared to life, and he drove off. But Mike felt something different in the air. A sense of peace, a weight lifting off his shoulders. Greg wasn't the threat anymore. It was time for something new. The next day, Mike and Tom were back at it, working on the shop. They had no idea what would come next, but for the first time in weeks, they felt like they had a real shot at making it work. The shop was alive again. The shop was buzzing with life as Mike and Tom worked tirelessly. The customers kept rolling in, one after another, each with a story about how Greg had overcharged them, lied to them, or given them the runaround. The word was spreading fast. Mike's garage was different. It wasn't just about fixing cars. It was about trust. And in a town where Greg had built his empire on cheap repairs and empty promises, Mike was offering something that hadn't been around in years, honesty. But Greg wasn't going to let this slide. That evening, as Mike was locking up for the night, he noticed something. A sleek, black luxury car rolled slowly into the parking lot. The engine purred as it came to a stop. Mike's heart skipped a beat. He knew exactly who it was. Jason Trent stepped out, his face unreadable. He stood there for a moment, taking in the sight of the shop, a full parking lot, customers chatting, laughing, and Mike working under the hood of a car. The scene looked so different from the empty lot that had been there just weeks ago. "So this is what you've been up to," Greg said, his voice dripping with contempt. Mike didn't flinch. He crossed his arms and met Greg's stare, his voice steady. "You seem surprised." Jason's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no humor in it. "You made a mistake, old man. This place won't last." Mike stood tall, refusing to let Greg intimidate him. "No, you made the mistake. You thought you could destroy what you built. I just gave people a better choice." Greg's jaw tightened, and for a moment the silence between them felt heavy. Jason's eyes burned with something Mike couldn't quite place. Anger, maybe, or just pure arrogance. Without saying another word, Jason turned and walked back to his car. He slid into the driver's seat and sped off, the tires screeching as he left the lot. Mike stood there for a moment, watching the car disappear into the night. He wasn't sure what to feel. He had expected a confrontation, but it was over so quickly. Still, a sense of peace washed over him. Greg wasn't going to break him. The next morning, Mike and Tom were back at the shop, already working before the sun was fully up. As they cleaned and repaired, they kept hearing more and more from the people in town. The customers who had been burned by Greg weren't just leaving his garage. They were flocking to Mike. They weren't just coming for a mechanic. They were coming for someone they could trust. And just when Mike thought things might finally settle down, it happened. The phone rang early that morning. Word had spread. More people were on their way, and soon the lot was full again. A group of customers stepped forward, shaking Mike's hand one by one. "I've been going to Greg for years," one man said, "but I'm done with him. You're the real deal, Mike. I'll bring my cars here from now on." Mike looked around at the growing crowd, overwhelmed by the support. He had done it. Against all odds, against Greg's sabotage, they had built something stronger than before. The shop wasn't just a business anymore. It was a community. And as Mike looked around at the bustling shop, a quiet satisfaction settled in. He had rebuilt more than just the garage. He had earned back his dignity, his purpose, and the respect of everyone who had ever trusted him. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, Mike knew they were on the right side of it. Wow, what a journey Mike has been through. From being fired after 30 years of hard work to rebuilding his life and business from the ground up. It's a story of resilience, trust, and never giving up, even when things seem impossible. But now, we want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to rebuild from scratch? Or have you ever had to stand up to someone who tried to take everything from you? Let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from? And how does Mike's story resonate with you? It's so inspiring to see how, despite the odds, Mike found a way to build something even stronger than before, with the support of his community. What do you think was the turning point for Mike? Was it his decision to take a chance on himself, or was it the loyal customers who stood by him? I'd love to hear your thoughts, and feel free to share your own experiences as well. And hey, if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in this incredible story. There's so much more to come, and you won't want to miss it. Let's keep the conversation going. Drop a comment below.